slides. Hopefully people can see the cover slide now. And let me just start, Margaret, by thanking you for that extraordinarily kind introduction. I feel like I should bring you everywhere I do a polling presentation and have you introduce me. That was very, very kind. And I want to thank Elizabeth and Children's Funding Project as well for having the idea for this research and underwriting it. And I think we've learned an enormous amount, both from the national survey we recently completed and from our meta-analysis of dozens of polls done at the state and local level, including many done by partners who are on this call today, that helped us identify some trends in public attitude toward funding for children and youth that we have tried to crystallize here and hopefully will be helpful to all of you in your work moving forward. We have a lot of data to share. This is sort of the highlights of these research projects. There is a wealth of more sort of detail and nuance to what we explored. And Elizabeth, if anyone is interested, can let you know what other resources are available coming out of this project through the Children's Funding Accelerator. So let's go ahead and dive in and see some of what we learned. Now, I'm going to talk about two pieces of research here back to back. The first is a meta-analysis of several dozen studies from all over the country over the course of the last 10 years or so about funding for youth in different contexts. We've tried to take what we saw in those studies and distill them into some common conclusions and some new insights, things that people have been experimenting with and trying in a handful of locations that might be worth replicating elsewhere. And then the second piece is a national voter survey that explored a lot of those sort of relevant emerging issues that Elizabeth described a few moments ago. We'll start with the findings from the meta-analysis, because that really is sort of the foundation on which the national survey was built. And I think there's a lot that we've learned here that adds some important insights that supplement the new survey data. So here you'll see a summary of the approach we used in reviewing the data and summarizing it. We basically were looking at over 50 different studies from communities across the country. Almost all of them have been conducted in the last decade. We have identified the locations of where most of these studies came from at the bottom of the slide, so you can have a sense of the community context from which the data arose. There are some places where the research is part of an ongoing effort, and we wanted to respect the confidentiality of the work that they're doing, and so we've sort of anonymized some of that data. Throughout, if you look in the lower right-hand corner of each slide, you'll see one of two notations, something that either says consistent finding, which indicates that this is something we've seen over and over and over across communities in the research, or new insight. In other words, this is a new message, a new funding mechanism, a new question that some community has come up with in their research that we think has some potential and ought to be looked at in other locations as well. So first, just a little bit about the nature of the challenge, and especially as we got ready for the national survey and we're thinking about the federal level here, one of the things that we are obviously always working to overcome is that although polling is great in principle, when it talks about voter support for more investment in early childhood, at the same time, we also see that voters often don't view it as urgent, or at least elected leaders don't often perceive it as urgent, and therefore put it later in line relative to other funding priorities, whether it's addressing COVID or issues related to housing or healthcare. So why is this? We wanted to see what the data tells us about why this might be the case and how we might push past it. The first thing to note is that even if voters say that investment in early childhood is a relatively low priority, it doesn't mean they don't want action taken. This was evident in a national survey that was conducted last year, where, as you'll see, large numbers of those voters who, even though they say it is not necessarily an important priority for the president and Congress, want more done in a wide range of different areas, whether it's childcare or pre-K, or promoting the affordability of these kinds of services for kids. So a lack of urgency doesn't mean do nothing. And that's an important conclusion to draw away. The second thing to remember is that it is often the case that voters see these issues as ones that ought to be addressed by state and local government as well. This is some data from Georgia and Louisiana, where we asked people, the pollsters asked people to identify which level of government should be primarily responsible for supporting childcare. And state government was the one that usually came out on top, local government close to on a par with federal government in each case. So this may be something where voters don't necessarily see a national priority, but they want local government to step up. We have also seen that the level of urgency that voters assign to childhood and youth services relative to others can depend on how those policy choices are framed. The slide you're looking at here is one that Margaret Brodkin gets credit for. She insisted we ask this question in San Joaquin County a couple years ago, and the results were very illuminating. When we ask people whether there's a need for different kinds of funding at the county level in San Joaquin County, public safety is very high on the list. But in reality, the elements of public safety that the county addresses are the sheriff, the probation system, and the courts. And those elements of public safety are seen as a much lower priority than early childhood education and preschool. So what that tells us is the more tangible we get about what services government is actually providing, those services for children and youth can sometimes vault higher when we get more specific and aren't talking in generalities. So a couple of other trends in terms of policy that were evident in some of the collected data across the country. The question of universality, whether programs should be designed to be available for everybody or whether they should be designed to be available for families that are facing financial challenges. This is data from a Louisiana survey where a majority of respondents, when asked to choose between those two alternatives, said that they favored providing funding for all kids. Versus about 2 in 5 who said they favored targeting that aid to struggling families. When voters are given a direct choice this way, this is often how the result comes out, with people expressing a preference for services being available for all children. We tested this a different way in the national survey, and it actually shows that if you don't force voters to make this choice, they perhaps don't feel quite as strongly about the distinction between these two options. But we'll come back to that in just a minute. I also want to talk a little bit about funding mechanisms, because obviously this is the most challenging element of putting together ballot measures to raise funding for kids. Voters are all for it, but how it gets paid for is, of course, the less enjoyable aspect of any funding proposal, but it's critical to getting it passed. A wide range of different funding mechanisms have been tested across these polls that we looked at over the course of the last decade. And there's generally a hierarchy in the level of support that funding mechanisms receive, which is detailed here. Sin taxes are at the top of the list, whether it's gambling, tobacco, alcohol, cannabis. Those tend to get overwhelming majority support, probably the easiest kinds of taxes to pass overall. Taxes that are explicitly progressive, that are targeted to the wealthy or to businesses that are, particularly businesses, larger businesses and more profitable businesses, also tend to be popular taxes. Why are those two the sort of leading categories? Well, because they're taxes that you as an individual taxpayer don't pay, or you can opt into if you indulge in one of those vices that's going to be taxed there. Support tends to be somewhat lower for sales taxes and property taxes. These are broad-based taxes that voters have to pay. Lots of examples of majority support for even these kinds of broad-based taxes, but it does require generally a little bit more of an effort to get them across the finish line than it does for some of those funding mechanisms you'll see at the top of the slide. We delved into this in much greater detail in the national polling, and I'll have some more numbers for you to look at in just a few minutes.
Dave,
yeah.
Before you go on, is there going to be a place where we talk about set-asides, or would this be the place to ask that question?
This would be a good place to talk about that, Margaret. That was one of the slides I deleted for time, but there's also broad support in principle for set-asides of existing budget revenue. The percentage of an overall local budget that we often are asking to set aside for kids is relatively small in absolute terms. Voters generally are very positive about that idea in the abstract. Obviously, a campaign that involves other interests that receive local government funding, sort of in competition for it, can change those dynamics a little bit, but set-asides are generally on the higher end of that list of funding mechanisms in terms of the initial support that voters offer.
And that is so important to mention in California, since this is a place where we have done a lot of set-asides and something people are thinking about.
The bulk of what we want to focus on coming out of the message synthesis here, or the research synthesis, is messaging conclusions, because polls spend a lot of time trying to identify strong messages. We've seen lots of different iterations of these themes tested in different communities. And it was pretty clear that across the different places that polling has been done, there were some big differences in terms of which themes tended to be most consistently appealing for voters and which ones are perhaps a little bit more mixed. The 6 themes you see on this slide are the ones that over and over across time and across location tended to be ones that voters said made a strong case for investments in kids. We'll talk about each of these 6 in turn with some examples of the kind of messaging that has been used. Probably the best message we've ever seen tested, and it's almost always number 1 when it's polled, is a message that talks about the critical role that the early years of a child's life play in their brain development, and how important it is that they get the support and education they need in those early stages while their brains are forming. Voters see this in their own lives. It's not something they need to sort of see a footnoted research study to tell them. Voters tell us the kids are like sponges. They see how much they're soaking up in those early years of life. And so the notion that we should make focused investments to help kids during that critical time seems sort of obvious to voters. A second message that tends to score well is one that focuses on the importance of prevention and early intervention. The notion that it is both less expensive and more effective to reach kids before they face problems or challenges in their lives to ensure that they're prepared for what's coming, as opposed to dealing with the impacts of neglecting kids' needs later on. It is both better for the kids and less expensive for society. And so messaging which emphasizes those factors tends to work really well. It's important to not just look at it through an economic lens, but to focus on the impact on children themselves when we're stressing the importance of early intervention. The critical role of investments in early childhood in helping strengthen K-12 performance is also critical. Voters believe that if kids get off to a strong early start, they're going to do better when they start elementary school. And obviously that's important to them. It's also critical from a political perspective, because when investments in pre-K are seen as being in competition with investments in K-12. The pie is limited, we can't afford to cut slices for both of them. Pre-K will often come in second to K-12 education. So stressing that investments in pre-K are really investments in K-12 because of the foundation it will lay for kids helps to implicitly address that criticism that sometimes arises.
I just want to say this can apply to older children too, that after school, all kinds of supports for youth improve ability to succeed in school. And so that message, that theme can apply to more than just young children.
Absolutely. We are increasingly seeing messages that explicitly focus on equity become more and more salient as the public realizes that access to quality preschool and after-school programs is easily available to more affluent members of society, but is often not available to middle-income and working families. Messaging which highlights that gap is increasingly salient. Messages which focus on racial inequities as well also perform well, although there tends to be more partisan division when we're speaking about racial equity. And so the nature of the community in which the research is being done may have more to do with the traction of those kinds of messages. Certainly in California, just about any community in California, affordability and the cost of living are huge concerns right now. And so as we'll see, this messaging is particularly well suited to this state. When we're talking about equity, it's also important to think about positive versus negative framings. There are ways to talk about how the inequities in our current system can lead to kids not having the kinds of benefits that they would otherwise receive, that there can be negative consequences from underinvestment in kids. But the same message can also be framed from a positive perspective. When we do address these inequities, when we do make these investments, the positive results that come from it. This was a national poll that was done earlier this year that tested these two sort of framings compared to one another. And as you'll see, particularly for a number of demographic subgroups within the electorate, the positive framing, the benefits achieved by addressing inequities is better than talking about the negative consequences that come from failing to do so. We have seen increasingly that there is also increased potency for messaging that focuses on how these kinds of investments support parents. It is important always that we be stressing that the kinds of programs that we're talking about are here to complement the work that parents do. They are not intended to replace them. That is a message that critics will often raise. They'll say government and taxpayers are being asked to do what parents should be doing for their own kids. Messaging which says, no, this is about giving parents the tools and the help that they need to support their own children. That's very effective messaging. Again, it implicitly sort of shores us up against one of the major criticisms that sometimes is made of these kinds of investments. Since the start of the pandemic, we have also seen increased impact from some of this messaging as the burdens that parents are facing from having to juggle work and childcare responsibilities are increasingly recognized as a major problem. And then this is sort of a variation on that theme, which more aggressively takes the tack of saying, unless we have these kinds of investments, it's hard for families to have the strength that we need them to have. That making these investments is an investment in families themselves, parents and kids, bringing them together and helping them to succeed together. Again, especially perhaps in some more conservative communities, that kind of proactive framing can potentially be helpful. And then finally, as we're looking at these sort of top 6 messages overall, let's just not forget that people love kids, and the sort of instinctive care and affection that voters of all parties feel for the next generation is really what drives their support. Messaging that reinforces that, using visuals that reinforce it, can be really important and really persuasive. Any message has both an intellectual and an emotional component to it, and the best messages combine the two together. So we should never forget the incredible power of the kinds of emotional arguments that we can make for investments in kids. Now, there's a number of other themes that we saw in our review of the existing data that were effective in one or another community, but there was more variation in the degree to which they sort of stood out at the top of the list. Everything I just showed you are things that pretty much across communities pull well. These next couple themes are ones that have pulled well in some places and perhaps less well in others. A return on investment message, which focuses specifically on dollars and translating how investments in children and youth translate into savings for taxpayers or for communities down the road. Those messages can be effective in some places and with some elements of the electorate, typically more conservative voters, but in some places reducing the many benefits of investments in young people to dollars and cents leave some voters a little bit cold. So this is one that's important to test to understand how it plays in your community. Messaging that compares the amount of investment it takes to put someone in prison or through the criminal justice system versus investing in them when they're young in ways that work to their benefit is also, it's a variation on this theme, which can be a hugely effective contrast. On the right-hand side, you'll see the Do the Math program that the California Endowment put together here in California, which tried to sort of crystallize the sort of contrast in the economic costs of either investing in schools or investing in prisons. We found these kinds of visuals and these kinds of contrasts can be highly effective in making the case for those early investments in young people. Increasingly, we are seeing messaging that says that investment in early childhood educators is critically important. There is growing recognition among the public about how underpaid early childhood educators are, that especially when we have messaging that compares their wages to those of fast food workers or other low wage workers, stresses that with those kinds of wages, even people who care passionately about their work as educators and would like to make a career of it sometimes are not able to do so because they simply can't afford it. And again, everything that's happened over the course of the last year and a half has really underscored for people the tenuous nature of that workforce given low levels of compensation. So increasingly, we're seeing the public respond well to messages that say that we need to raise wages. It's good for educators, it's good for children, and it's going to pay off in the long run if we pay this workforce what it deserves. We have also seen some places where combining messaging around education and health for kids can be really powerful. More powerful than sort of making the case for education or health in silos. To the extent we have programs that are bringing these kinds of investments together in ways that are thoughtful and cohesive, the sum of their benefits can be greater, the whole is greater than the sum of the parts from voters' perspective. So weaving together those threads wherever it's possible for us to do so in our messaging helps give voters a sense of the holistic benefits that we can provide for young people. In California right now, by far the biggest problem that is facing the state in voters' minds is homelessness. We just finished a survey in Oakland last night. 96% of Oakland voters view homelessness as a very serious problem. Nothing else is even close to it. And obviously many people experiencing homelessness are families with children. And so whatever the sort of enormous challenges are that adults experiencing homelessness face, the public recognizes that kids facing homelessness are facing even more severe challenges, having to try to go to school and sort of do everything young kids need to do to learn and to stay healthy is much, much harder when you don't have a stable roof over your head. Messaging which focuses on this, investments which focus on this, here in California, almost always now showing up at the top of polling. Finally, we also wanted to highlight some themes and messages that are more pandemic specific that we've seen have a little more salience over the course of the last year or so. This is data from a survey that we did, I believe, in Washington State, where we detailed for the respondents the number of childcare facilities and preschools that have shut down or at risk of shutting down since the pandemic started, and then pairing that with the challenges that parents face during distance learning. What voters are telling us, 3 out of 5, is that, yeah, I've seen this and I'm viewing this issue of making sure that we have adequate services for young children as more important than I did before the pandemic. So that increased awareness, I think, gives us a real opportunity to communicate about it. The pressures that parents have been under as well. We've seen in a number of surveys that the challenges of juggling work and childcare responsibilities for parents now ranks among the top tier of concerns for voters in many states. And detailing the ways in which those pressures on parents can lead to problems for kids. In the case of this messaging, an increase in domestic violence and child abuse calls, underscores the urgency. It means this is an issue that can't wait, and it's something that we really need to take on now. We've also seen, and I think we have to be careful about this and sort of as time passes and think about the mood of a given community, but a positive sort of can-do message which says, we all came together, we've all done our part to try to defeat the pandemic. We need to show that same kind of community spirit when we think about children and youth and their needs and how to best help them going forward. I think over the course of the last 6 months, we have probably seen some of that sense of community solidarity fray as we've had battles about mask mandates and vaccination. But certainly in communities where the public has been a little bit more unified in their support for pandemic solutions, using that to say we need to take that kind of collective mindset to the next step for kids can be really important. Mental health impacts also have really stood out in the polling. A majority of voters in most polls that we do tell us that they have experienced increased mental health strain since the start of the pandemic. Among parents, a majority say that their kids have faced increased mental health strain. Recognizing that and saying that we need to make investments for children of all ages to address the mental health challenges they're facing can be a very compelling reason to support these investments right now. And that's another thing we'll see in the national survey data in just a moment. Now, at the same time, while we learned a bunch of things about how we should communicate from looking at the body of research across the country, we also saw some things that some message themes that were generally ineffective in a number of places where they were tried. Talking about the mechanics of measures, the processes by which money is distributed, or elements of governance that aren't sort of directly tied to accountability and transparency, tend to not be important to voters. The funding mechanism, with the exception perhaps of sin taxes, which in some cases are seen as deterring behaviors that the public would like to deter, like smoking. In most cases, focusing on the funding mechanism is not helpful for us. It is the benefits that voters and kids will receive from the investments that matters most. Downstream benefits, talking about how 10 years, 20 years down the road, we will be better off for making investments in kids today. Voters believe that to be true, but it's not always the most compelling reason to increase their taxes in the near term. And then finally, comparisons to other jurisdictions, saying our neighboring county has increased their taxes, we should do the same thing. That is often an ineffective line of argument, because voters say, hey, we chart our own path here. We don't necessarily have to do what our neighbors are doing. I also want to briefly talk about some of the things that we've seen in terms of opposition messaging that resonate in other polling. And 3 themes consistently stand out as the best reasons to vote no on measures like this. We can't afford to pay higher taxes, can't trust government to spend the money effectively, and there are more important things that we should be spending money on right now. These are not unique to measures dealing with children and youth. They are the same 3 things that tend to be the strongest arguments against investments in transportation or public safety or K through 12 education. And it means that our answers to them have less to do with the nature of the programs we're funding and more with the way that measures are structured in order to be affordable, to ensure transparent and accountable administration. And as we've seen in the messaging we just talked about, to highlight the urgency of acting now, stressing that these are not problems that we can just delay to another day. All right, so that is some of what came together from our review of this research in other states and locations. And again, I'll defer to Elizabeth, but there's a wealth of additional data that we've pulled together and other resources if you have more specific questions that we can take from that broader study. But what we learned from this research fed into the design of a new national voter survey that we administered in mid-August. We talked to just over 1,000 voters nationwide who voted in last year's election. And we asked them some specific questions about investments in kids, which, as Elizabeth previewed, are things that are obviously an important part of the conversation right now. We wanted to understand where voters ranked the urgency of providing opportunities for young people to get a strong start in life relative to other things that are part of the national conversation from a policy perspective. 82% of voters rate those investments in young people as a very important priority, putting it on a par with access to healthcare, reducing crime, strengthening the economy, and even not far behind K through 12 education. So when it's framed the way you see it framed here, improving opportunities for children to get a strong start in life, that is something that voters see as urgent. That urgency is most prominent among Democratic voters, but you'll see it's also present among independents. Republicans tend to be a little bit more skeptical, more focused on the economy, crime, and taxes. But we do have a third of Republicans that still are rating it as an extremely important priority, top of the list for them too. So there is an impressive degree of sort of bipartisan urgency that we can find here. We also asked voters to tell us, to rank the priority of different ways that we could invest money to benefit children in their community. We asked them to rate the importance of each of these on a 7-point scale, so we could really identify the proportion who felt most strongly about it. And you'll see that on the right-hand side of each of these graphs here. Those dark blue bars are the proportion that rated each item a 7. If we look at the average scores on a 7-point scale, anything over 4 is something that voters see as a higher than average priority. And pretty much every category of investment we asked them about had an average score over 4. So voters are saying, yes, these are important things. For each service, we did a split sample where for half the sample, we framed the service as being available to all youth. And for the other half of the sample, we framed it as going to youth with the greatest need. Testing this concept I mentioned earlier of universality versus targeted investments. You'll remember in previous research, when we ask voters to choose, they tend to favor the universal approach. But what you'll see here is when we just do a controlled experiment and present it as either universal or targeted, the levels of support are very, very similar, suggesting that for most voters, If it's presented to them as the sort of the best policy for the community, it's not necessarily something that they're asking for and trying to unpack whether it is universal or more targeted. If you look at the things that are at the top of the list here, mental health services for youth is the single most urgent priority of the ones that we tested. Very, very impressive. Obviously, we haven't asked this question in previous years the same way, so we don't know whether these numbers are higher than what we would have seen if we'd asked this question a year ago, 5 years ago, a decade ago. I strongly suspect that the numbers are higher than what we would have seen in previous years. Maternal and infant health services, also a high priority, and then after school and summer programs. A lot of the data you've seen is focused on early education and preschool. Here is data showing us that, in fact, after school and summer programs are viewed as being just as important a priority for voters. And in fact, if we go on to the next slide, you'll see that that is exactly the case numerically. When we line it up with infant and toddler childcare or with high quality preschool programs, the numbers are all very similar to one another. And we consistently have 6 out of 10, 7 out of 10 voters rating it a 5 to 7 on the 7-point scale. More than a third or 2 in 5 telling us that they think it should be a very high priority. In terms of voters' willingness to pay for investments in either early childhood education or programs and services for children of all ages, we see a pretty impressive willingness among voters to increase their taxes at the national level. 57% say they would support a local tax to support early childhood education, 61% for children of all ages. Those differences are within the survey's margin of error, so statistically about the same level of support. You know, we are talking about a tax increase here. We say a modest increase in local taxes, not even a small increase, but a modest increase. So this is, I think, a pretty strong endorsement. In California, the numbers were within the margin of error, given our subsample of Californians within the national sample of what you see here. We also wanted to test some frames for how those investments might be made that are a little bit more value-based than the sort of programmatic things that we just looked at. So we offered the respondents a list of different sort of principles that might guide the investment of money to support children and youth, and asked them to rate each one as either extremely, very, somewhat, or not too important. And here, the items that you'll see at the top of the list, all of these, at least roughly 2/3 of voters or more, are rating as very important. Equity, focusing on income, education, or or race or ethnicity. Mental health, again, stands out as a priority for investment. Addressing child abuse and neglect that have accelerated during the pandemic, and then supporting economic recovery by making it possible for parents to return to work. All of these, at least 66% of voters are rating as very important. A different formulation of the equity message, which focuses more narrowly on race and ethnicity, not education or income or other socioeconomic factors, still has 65% of voters rating it very important, but not quite the same breadth to it that we see when we have a broader definition of equity. And there's a number of polls that have showed this same dynamic. A more narrow focus on race tends to lead Republican support to fall off a little bit more, whereas if race is paired with a variety of other factors in describing an equity lens, it tends to get a little bit broader support. I will note that in the California data, both versions of the equity message polled the same, and they were both at the top of the list. So that disparity seems to be less the case here in California than it might be in other parts of the country. Obviously, this is a much bluer state relative to the rest of the national electorate, also a much more racially and ethnically diverse state than most of the rest of the country. And I think all those factors perhaps mitigate some of those differences in the themes. Now, it's one thing for voters to tell us that they would be willing to pay more in taxes. It's another for them to sort of specifically say, all right, here's how much I'd be willing to take out of my wallet every year in order to support these kinds of investments. So we asked a question, testing willingness to pay on both an annual basis or a monthly basis. And again, we split our sample to look at the difference between investments in early childhood services and services for children of all ages. Once again, statistically, no difference between the children's ages in terms of willingness to pay, and very impressive levels of investment that voters indicate they're willing to make here. basically 2/3 of voters telling us they're willing to pay 150 years or even, $150 per year, or an even slightly larger amount, $15 per month. 63% are willing to make that investment as well. So that is obviously very good news. Obviously, a lot depends on the specifics of what an individual tax mechanism might mean in terms of its impact on an individual voter and how money might be allocated. But this is a great number to see. And it suggests that those earlier numbers where we talked about taxes in the abstract, voters were a little more skittish than when we gave them these specific dollar amounts, some of them fairly substantial in terms of what they would raise. So again, just sort of underscoring that voters' commitment is more than in principle, it's also financial. We also tested a range of funding mechanisms in the poll. Some of these things that have been tried in a number of communities, others that are somewhat new in terms of their being used. And you'll see everything on this slide, at least 60% of voters rated an acceptable way to raise money, either for early childhood or for children of all ages. Sports betting at the top of the list, whether it is online or legal. Hugely popular to tax that. And here in California, as I think most of you know, we have not one, not two, but 3 ballot measures potentially headed to the November ballot next year to establish a framework for legalizing sports betting and taxing it in some fashion in the state. So this is a conversation that is salient all over the country in the wake of a recent Supreme Court decision and will be coming up here in California. Generally speaking, progressive taxes that focus on businesses with high values of property, very potent, and even individual residential properties at over $1 million. Voters see it as acceptable to tax those.
Hey Dave, can I just say one thing on the progressive?
Yeah.
So just so people don't misconstrue the word progressive, what we're talking about is progressive tax structure versus regressive tax structure. So we wanted to understand if voters were more favorable toward things that would have a lesser impact on people who are already struggling in some way, right? So that's what we mean when we say progressive.
Yes. Thank you, Elizabeth. That's an important point. Yes, not progressive ideologically, but meaning a higher tax rate on people who have more of the resource or wealth that is being taxed, a lower tax rate on those with a lower amount. And whatever the mechanism, we see that progressivity in tax structure tends to get more appeal from voters, particularly true here in California. We've really seen that very intensely in the state, given the huge gaps in income and wealth that are present in many communities. As Elizabeth noted, we wanted to understand the impact, if any, of the conversation around federal funding. We asked whether voters had heard about the funding that was in the rescue plan or that's still being debated a couple months later for the Build Back Better plan. About half of voters said they'd heard something. Only less than 1 in 5 said they'd heard a lot, and that's probably a truer indication of people's awareness. In California, the numbers were actually a little bit lower in both cases. So not a lot of voters at that time paying a ton of attention. And when we asked voters, gave them a description of the kinds of investments that would be coming up in kids, and then asked them how confident they were that those investments would address all the needs in their own local community that children and youth might have, only 7% said they were very confident. We've repeated this question in some state and local surveys since then and seen very similar results. So not a ton of awareness of what's about to be spent at the federal level, and most voters believe there will continue to be a local need, even if that funding is approved. And we put a finer point on it with a follow-up question where we asked people to choose between the 2 statements you see listed here. This federal legislation means we'll still need additional funding, or we won't need any. And by a margin of 60 to 16, they say that new funding they think will be needed at the local level. Among the 60% who feel that way, we had a follow-up question and asked them where they thought that additional funding for their community should come from. And they could give us multiple responses, which is why this adds up to more than 100. You'll see people wanted an even bigger investment from the federal government, also state investment, local investment slightly lower, and then people pointing to sources of revenue outside of government as well, either parents themselves or philanthropy, providing some of the resources needed. So I think the pretty clear takeaway from this, and again, exploring it different ways in other local surveys, we've seen most voters are grateful about and supportive of what the federal government may spend, but very realistic in perceiving that that is not going to satisfy the need and that additional revenue is still going to have to be provided. So that, I believe, yes, takes us to the end of the presentation. I know that is a lot to absorb in a pretty short period of time, but I think just a wealth of really helpful data here that has been put together. And again, what we shared today is just a fraction of some of the resources available. And I think Elizabeth put in the chat how you can get access to more of them as well. Elizabeth or Margaret, if there's anything you'd like to add, please do. And otherwise, I'm happy to answer questions.
Yeah, so if you stop sharing, then we can see your face. Everybody's face is better. Always more fun. There was an interesting point made in the chat by Bonnie Politz, who is a youth development person. And I know a lot of people on this are working on youth issues as opposed to early childhood issues, which recently, and the brain development issue has been a very core part of the justice reform arguments, with the idea that young people's brains are not developed until, age 24 now. So we are, increasing the age at which we're trying to show flexibility and sensitivity to the whole issues about brain development. It's core to issues about getting kids out of detention and having different approaches to them. It might be something we could pull in the future, but given the strength of that argument for young children, it seems we should mention that. And since I'm personally steeped in those in those issues, I have heard about brain development over and over. We're talking teenagers and young adults. And anybody who's the parent of a young adult already knows this. So are there other questions or comments that people want to make? You can raise your hand or you can put a question in the chat. I'll try to find a raised hand if I can. I don't know, Elizabeth, if you want to say anything more about these findings. I think I want to.
Well, I forgot to leave out, I forgot to mention, one of the reasons we did it is because we've got, just like you do, Margaret, in California, we've got a cohort of places that are getting ready to pursue ballot measures. And one of the things we thought would be helpful is us to sort of get the ball rolling with a national poll, recognizing that you ultimately really should do your own local poll, because there's a lot of sort of difference in how voters are responding in different parts of the country. So
yeah, but the issues of homelessness and mental health seem to cut across, post the pandemic, seem to cut across a lot of places. So, I'm trying to recommend people get that in there, whatever you want to find. It'll help with homelessness and it'll help with mental health issues. So we do, Brian asked, how do these metrics change regionally across California? That's a really important question, since there's the Valley and the Bay Area and LA. And Steve Fowler is asking if Build Back Better passes with extra money, would that have any impact on voter support for state and local funds? So what do you think about those questions, Dave?
So on Brian's question, absolutely, there will be different numbers across California. Elizabeth's right, every community is different. And while these themes can sort of provide a starting place in thinking about how to message, there's no guarantee that every community is going to be the same. In California, you raised the example of the Bay Area versus the Inland Empire. There are big partisan differences between coastal and inland California, and partisanship is still the biggest dividing line when we're talking about taxes and investment. So that's going to lead to some differences. Much larger Latino and Spanish speaking population in the Inland Empire than in many parts of the Bay Area. And that also has an impact, generally a positive one. We see communities of color, and especially the Latino community, strongly supportive of taxes to invest in early childhood. So all of these things mean that the sort of the size of the support and opposition coalitions, the messaging that's going to be most effective, and obviously the nature of the need in each community will be different. So we need to have a healthy respect for the fact that those differences will exist, even if some of these themes are pretty consistent. In terms of the Build Back Better Act's passing and the impact it will have, perhaps I've gotten kind of jaded and cynical over the years as a pollster, but I just think federal investment takes so long to filter down and sort of reach local communities. And when it does, the degree to which it is recognized as being the result of federal investment is often, it's been attenuated because it's passed through a number of hands on its way to the community. And we all know objectively, especially as the size of this bill has been pared down, that it will not satisfy all the needs that we know are present. I would love to think that by next year, we'd have a bunch of voters who are feeling increased confidence and sort of happiness at the availability of services for children and youth in their community, but I think they're likely to still perceive needs even next year. So my sense is that the perspectives we're seeing now where voters are saying this is good but not enough is likely to continue, but that's obviously something we can monitor going forward as well.
And this sounds really cynical, but just like where we asked voters if they would pay $150 a year or $15 a month, my guess was that voters don't really do the math, and it proved out. I mean, people were sort of a little bit all over the place on that, right? They were willing to pay more if they just saw it by month. And the same holds true, I think, for the federal bills. We asked specifically about emergency stimulus funding and any new funding that the administration is talking about. And I think people just don't, people have busy lives. They're not paying close attention to those kinds of details. So not to say that doesn't mean we shouldn't work to educate people on it, but if you're really trying to put something in front of the voters, I don't think they get into that minutia. Maybe in California they do, Margaret. I don't know.
I don't know. I just know that if I hear that we're going to pay for childcare one more time on MSNBC, I am totally confused by it. I am, convinced now that everybody's going to get their childcare through the federal government, and I know that is absurd, not going to happen. And it will pay for a portion. So we will have our work cut out for us, but. Yeah, I take these findings very seriously, and to inspire people to do stuff at the local level, because that's where people feel they're going to see the results. And so we do have about 5 campaigns that will be on the ballot in California in 2022. We have one that's on the ballot now in Santa Cruz, a set aside of the cannabis tax. Other people are looking for parcel taxes, set asides, sales taxes, and a parcel tax in South San Francisco that would impact only like Google and Genentech and Amazon and the big businesses there. So there's a lot to think about. And our next webinar for California will be on what our legal options here are in California for revenue. And we have a new white paper out on that. And we will discuss also the court cases. We don't tend to talk as much about the idea of set-asides. And I want to remind you, Dave, that our first meeting like 8 years ago, that was what you said. People will support this. They will support the idea that kids should get a fair share. So it is something we need to continue thinking about, polling about, and people need to think about putting on the ballot. So I'm just thrilled that, thank you so much, Dave. It's always a pleasure. If anybody else has anything to say, we will be sending slides. We'll be sending links to the Children's Funding Project materials. Anybody who registers for one of our webinars is unfortunately permanently on our mailing list. So if you will get other things about the work that we're doing. And thank you so much for coming.